Earlier this year, Richard Dawkins wrote a Spectator diary and said that if he had to choose between Islam and Christianity, then he'd go for the latter, even though he is one of the world's most famous atheists. He's recently gone a bit further and declared himself a cultural Christian.
We are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer.
So is that really a thing? And should we see this as his baby steps towards perhaps a fuller conversion? I'm delighted to be joined by Sally Hitchiner, who's Associate Vicar at St Martin in the Fields, and by Esme Partridge, who joins us from Clare College in Cambridge. Now, Sally, 10 years ago you got to know Richard Dawkins because you both sat for an official portrait. So for 3 days, as I understand it, you had basically nothing else to do apart from to chat to him. Do you think you managed to get through to him? I mean, because back then, 10 years ago, I'm not sure he would be describing himself as any sort of Christian, let alone a cultural one.
I'm not sure I got through to him. I think he got through to me in some ways. I think I was very sceptical about who he was. I'd only ever seen him in a very combative role with religious leaders. And I was actually very charmed by him. He was very sweet and he was very sincere. He struck me as being someone who was slightly baffled that some people didn't really understand what he was saying on some occasions. But he definitely seemed to be very sincere, and I really enjoyed meeting him.
So, Sally, he says now that he's a cultural Christian. Do you think there is such a thing? I mean, I imagine if I asked you to define Christian, you would say quite simply somebody who believes in Jesus Christ, which obviously he doesn't.
I don't think he would say he believes Jesus rose from the dead. I think that's pretty clear from the interviews and the stuff he's done recently. But I'd say he believes Jesus is an historical figure and maybe even has some good moral advice for some people. And that's definitely the sort of tone of the conversation we had, and what I believe he said elsewhere since then. I think there's a question of, can you be a cultural Christian? I think there's a lot to be gained from the culture of Christianity. Perhaps we're really talking about Anglicanism here in his life and the life of others. And I think people like Tom Holland have highlighted the value that the Christian belief has offered Western society, and the idea that the individual matters and that we should care for the poor and all those sorts of things that I think Richard Dawkins would want to promote. Does he believe in any miracles? Does he believe that there is a God? Probably not, as far as I know. But I think there's still a lot to be gained from engaging with Christianity on lots of different levels.
Now, Esme, you get lots of people who say, for example, that they're culturally Jewish, but they're not practicing. You can get people who enjoy carol services. One might even attend religious ceremonies and feel moved by it, even though they don't necessarily believe in God. So do you think we can see the emergence of people who can credibly call themselves cultural Christians and can be seen as part of the Christian movement?
I think it's absolutely possible, but I think the problem is it's not sustainable. And Dawkins, you might think, well, that's not relevant because he doesn't particularly want Christianity to persist. But actually, in the LBC interview, he explicitly said, well, I'm happy that the numbers of believers are going down, but I wouldn't be happy if our cathedrals closed and our beautiful parish churches had to shut. And I think that's where I would criticise, because while it may be possible in this particular cultural moment where we have enough of the vestiges of tradition to sustainably hold that position, those vestiges are very much fading, and I think we've come to the point where it's simply not enough to say, oh, yes, I'd like to keep this fruit of Christianity or this particular socio-cultural aspect of it, but just to use this sort of botanical analogy, which I mentioned in my article, to sever it from the root, that simply doesn't work, especially not in a time where there are other competing and arguably more compelling ideologies which actually do assert themselves and what they represent. Islam being, of course, the one on Dawkins' mind.
Sally, in your church, St Martin's in the Fields, it's world-renowned for its music and its architecture and its position in London. But in your congregation, do you see regular people who, as far as you're aware, don't believe in God?
Oh, I've never asked them all. I like to think I'm convincing them to believe in Christ in particular. That's why we preach, and what we hope we're conveying is, and I think there is something in the character of Christ which is very inviting and very compelling. But I would say that I would humbly suggest to Richard, if he was here now, that perhaps he is experiencing something of God in his love of the beauty of the music and the beauty of choral evensong and carol services. I think there's something in goodness and truth and beauty as well as in truth, it to be engaged with in Christianity. And I think there's something about the heart of Christianity, as Esme was talking about which I would say is Jesus Christ, which I think can be experienced without necessarily understanding or adhering to every particular line of the creed. I think it often leads us into truth, and I suspect you can't engage with something as beautiful as choral music and evensong without being moved in some way towards the divine. And I would say Christ, but I think I think there's lots of reasons why people reject the formal language of religion. Some of them very sincere and very good, and sometimes people are rejecting the church because they don't see enough of what they imagine God should be like in us. And I think there's something actually I would call worshipful about rejecting the church, because it doesn't look like, if there is a God, it wouldn't look like us. And I don't know Richard well enough to know why he's rejecting the language of Christianity and things like that. But I definitely take it as a huge step forward and a huge compliment that he's willing to say anything positive about us at all, because I can't imagine he sells many books by doing that.
Esme, I would have thought that where you are now in Cambridge University, the evidence of cultural Christianity is all around you. And there was lots of these evensong services. You've got choirs attended by really quite people who are devout, shall we say, to the art of what they do. But not all of them, to put it mildly, believe in God. Cambridge is full of colleges named after saint this and saint that, and without any kind of ecclesiastical hope altogether, purpose at all. And also, you've got, take choral music, for example. You've got John Rutter, one of the greatest, perhaps, living writers of choral music. He doesn't believe in God, yet he's been able to give us some of the most incredible choral music that's ever been written. So it would seem as if the influence and the power of non-believing Christianity, if you want to call it that, is strong and is getting stronger.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture, because on the one hand, yes, of course, there is this atmosphere of if you want to call it cultural Christianity, very much permeating, and it does speak to a lot of people. You certainly get people who actually become Christians at university, I think, because they experience the chapel and that kind of pastoral aspect of the college. But at the same time, it's not all going in one direction. Just the other week, we heard about St. John's Voices really sacrificing their tradition of Anglican choral music for more diverse types of song. And I don't know exactly what that entails, but if you can look at the way that some other college chapels are going, it may well be more in the direction of renouncing a uniquely Christian identity and tradition for a more multicultural one. So, for example, multi-faith chapels are, okay, only a few, I wouldn't want to exaggerate, but certainly a trend we are starting to see. So Queen's College, I believe, or is it St. Catherine's? I need to double check, but that is now a multi-faith. They're embracing a more multi-faith model. Now, that's not something I think is bad. And actually, I'm studying the philosophy of religious pluralism, so I'm by no means saying that's inherently bad, but it is a sign of a sense of Christian identity, which, while it may bask in those aesthetic mores and the beauty of choral music and all of these other wonderful things, if it's not strong enough to actually assert itself, over time the trend does overwhelmingly seem to be that it's renouncing itself ultimately for other more diverse belief systems, and long term I don't see how Christianity would maintain its cultural dominance even in these elite institutions, with that being the trend.
And Sally, isn't that the risk, that you basically end up diluting the faith? That if you just sell the kind of warm and fuzzy bits about the faith, like God is like a cup of tea, etc., then you miss out the core of the Bible's message. You miss out the core of Christianity. In fact, you start to become a place not really of Christianity, but of sort of music and aesthetics, which is fine and there's a place for it, but it's difficult to call it religion if it's not actually belief.
It's difficult to call it working class. And I think actually one of the things at the heart of Christianity is that we follow a working class Messiah. And I think a lot of the trappings that we talk about when we talk about sort of cultural Christianity are essentially just choral music, are things that we often associate with middle class values. But I think actually Richard is pointing at something deeper. I think there is a sense of ethics, a sense of a commitment to living for others, public service, caring for the poor, living a life that is following the model of people like Jesus, which I think is actually open to everyone. I think there is something really important in that goes beyond the trappings, as we call them.
Is any of that really Christian? By no stretch of the English language, I submit. Is that? I mean, we can't. If you're saying it's Christian, then you're saying that Christians do this in the way that Hindus don't, or Muslims don't, or Chinese Buddhists don't. I mean, these are virtues. I get it; they're admirable. Every Christian should aspire to them, but they're not identifiably Christian. I mean,
well, Tom Holland would disagree with you. The historian Tom Holland would point to the idea that prior to Christianity, the idea that the powerful should care about the weak was totally alien to Greek and Roman gods and the sorts of societies that were prevalent around that time. Is it only Christianity that has discovered it? Of course not. But I would argue that God works in all sorts of different ways, and that we can discern these things in different faiths as well as in Christianity, which is why I found some of Richard's comments a little bit perplexing, perhaps. I have some colleagues who are Muslims who I think are doing extraordinary work and are living by those values that I see in Christ. But I think there's something really important that is at the centre of Christianity, which you may see through the trappings, but also you can easily just miss, and that is the personal life commitment that Christianity is. I mean, the Americans talk about being a born again Christian as if you're an entirely new person, and in Anglicanism we have a much more institutional idea that you can grow and a whole community can grow together, and through sharing what we have with our parishes, with our communities, and that actually, I think once you are not so focused on the idea that God sends everyone to hell, there is a possibility of finding a generous version of religion which can allow people to discover things on the edges and find value in them without needing to deconstruct that.
And Esme, just quickly, I mean, the conversion process takes some time, doesn't it? I mean, anybody who's been a member of a church will know what the idea is. You get somebody to come along to a Christmas service, you get them to enjoy the aesthetics, then you try to sell the harder truths to them, and by the end of it, we could be seeing Richard Dawkins' book, Why I Became a Christian.
Well, possibly. I mean, I think actually Dawkins can be placed within a very specific and quite established tradition within the liberal sort of history, and that's actually a very kind of 18th century position of someone like Montesquieu, who believes in Christianity as a social institution, but at the same time is ruthlessly mocking it and totally incredulous towards its actual truth claims, and that was a very, very common position during the Enlightenment, and I think especially the 18th century, where you have on the one hand this total hostility towards the contents, but at the same time this conviction that but of course this great social order we have because of religion is self-evident, that's never going to go away. And I think that was very much the position that I got from his LBC interview and comments he's made elsewhere. The problem with that position, I think, is that as I said earlier, it hasn't really been vindicated by history as being particularly sustainable. I think there's a certain naivety about it, actually, to think that these Christian values are self-evident and that they'll be capable of being upheld even while the truth claims of the religion aren't. I think one only has to look at how liberalism, for example, something which was originally premised on Christian foundations, but took it for granted that people would always have this basic Christian character and there'd always be this biblical morality. But that clearly hasn't really been the case. I mean, unless you're a practicing Christian, today your idea of liberty is probably completely disembedded from those original Christian values. So the reason I say all of this is because I think it's a very established tradition, and that cynicism towards belief, I find it hard to imagine Dawkins coming out of that. I think he's likely to take this more instrumentalist, very Enlightenment view of religion as socially useful, but fundamentally untrue.
I'm more hopeful, actually. I think there is I really think that he's got something that his experience goes beyond what his intellect is willing to engage with, or perhaps his book sales are willing to engage with. I think there's something. I expect I'll see Richard in heaven. Actually, I suspect I'll see. He might be surprised to get there, but I really do expect that I will engage with him and see him in the afterlife in a way that I recognise as Christian.
Well, on that heavenly note, Sally and Esme, thank you very much for joining me on Spectator TV.